We're going to go ahead and get started right on time. My name is Ben Kesnoke. I'm a partner here at Village Global, and on behalf of my partners, Ross Fubini, Ann Duane, and Eric Tornberg, welcome to another edition of Lessons from Luminaries, brought to you by Village Global. We're thrilled to host you here at this world-famous science museum, the Exploratorium, on this stunningly gorgeous San Francisco day. Village Global, as many of you know, is an early-stage venture capital firm backed by some of the world's most successful entrepreneurs like Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Sarah Blakely, and indeed Bill Gates. And I think Bill Gates being with us here this morning is a testament to just how passionate these luminaries are about supporting the next generation of innovators, many of whom, of course, are in this room. We have about 80 to 100 world-class founders here with us this morning, and I want to give a special shout-out to the founders in our Network Catalyst program. Next week, we'll be announcing some special news regarding a new vintage of Network Catalyst, so stay tuned for that. For this morning's event, of course, we have our LP, Bill Gates, in conversation with another extraordinary entrepreneur and friend of Village Global, Julia Hartz. Julia is co-founder, CEO of Eventbrite, and recently took the company public on the New York Stock Exchange. But 3/4 of the way through the conversation, they'll stop the conversation, and folks can line up at these two stationary mics to ask questions. Please keep your question very brief. And feel free to tweet anything from the conversation. You can tag us at Village Global. At the conclusion of their conversation, I'll be back with a short announcement, and then we'll break to the beautiful area outside for a reception. Without further ado, please welcome Julia Hartz and Bill Gates.
Thank you all for coming, and this is a pretty epic location.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
You have the better view.
Yeah, the bridge looks good.
Well, thank you, Bill, for taking the time this morning. Leading up to this great opportunity and honor to interview Bill, my team and I have spent a couple of weeks just going deep, and it's been just fascinating. It's actually been really helpful for my team as we've been thinking about 2019 planning, which I'm sure you don't miss much, but probably still do to some extent. And we have been thinking about themes around creating long-term value and really about the importance of sustainable business and philanthropy. And so today we're going to take a little bit of a journey through the different parts of how you've made this world a better place. And I wanted to start with really acknowledging the entrepreneurs and founders in this room and how much collective blood, sweat, and tears we've given to our companies. As the founder and operating CEO for 25 years of one of the most prolific and valuable startups, I wanted to start with your perspective on the important choices that you made during your tenure at Microsoft and how you view those choices as they've related to the long-term growth story of the company.
Well, Microsoft was very lucky in that we're not a capital-intensive business. So it was financed by money I'd made in high school. And I did the school scheduling, and there was all sorts of software things you could do and make money fairly easily in those days, because the number of people who knew how to do software things was very small. We did take an investment. We sold 5% of the company at a valuation of $20 million, took in $1 million from a venture firm, Dave Marquardt's venture firm, just because we wanted to have him, actually it was more the senior people, but it ended up being him, advise us about various choices we had to make. And so those early days, because we knew that software was this magical thing, and it was enabled because the chip was magical, and weirdly, people didn't understand that Moore's law essentially said that computing power would be infinite. And so the best way to think about it was to say, okay, software would be the limiting factor towards any sort of digitally assisted activity. And we thought of ourselves as a software company. We ended up competing with companies that were single product companies. So like, I wonder if anybody's here has ever heard of like Ashton Tate, or has anybody ever heard of Ashton Tate? Okay, good. There was a great article where I gave a hardcore speech about our database, and it said, Gates says Ashton Tate never existed, but I didn't actually say that. I just said that they might cease to exist at some point. Anyway, very competitive. There was a spreadsheet called 123, a word processor called WordPerfect. So these were single product companies. And in terms of really building your engineering tools, your international distribution, sales, consulting, how you work with corporate Salesforce, if you thought of yourself as a software company and a platform company, it was very different than saying, okay, I have 123, which was a Lotus spreadsheet product. So we didn't fail for ambition, but then the intensity of executing on it was super, super hard.
When you think about the people who helped you, really get Microsoft into a scaling zone beyond your founding team, can you reflect on one of the most important hires you made that maybe we don't know about, but would give us insight into the early days?
Yeah, so the one you probably do know about is Steve Ballmer. Steve was with me at Harvard. He went off and worked he actually graduated, went to Procter & Gamble, and then he was going to Stanford Business School. And I had so overcommitted the firm because I was always worried we had lots of customers go bankrupt, and I was hiring people who had children, they were moving to the city, and so I'd always do this calculation of, okay, do I have enough money that if nobody pays me, can I pay the employees for over a year? And so I realized I needed somebody who could hire people and maybe even tell me not to sell things that weren't done yet. So I convinced Steve to drop out of business school. He came on and he was extremely good at hiring people. Then we realized we needed somebody who'd been in a large corporation. We made a mistake. We hired somebody from Tektronix who, when we interviewed him, we were so embarrassed that why would he want to come to our crummy little company? We forgot to interview him. But then after 6 weeks, when he hadn't plugged his computer in, we actually decided that he wasn't the right person. But there was a person who worked at Radio Shack, a guy named John Shirley, that I wanted to hire. And I couldn't even say it because I really respected John. He was a huge customer at that point. And so I had the venture capitalist, Dave Marquardt, is on the board, go say to John that I wanted to hire him. And John was like, well, of course, God, I'd love to come there. So I guess I underestimated our attractiveness at that point. But he came in, and he was the adult who had done financial planning. Like, we made this mouse peripheral, and we had a warehouse full of them because we'd made too many. I mean, just such stupid things. And John just completely got that stuff under control. He was president for 9 years.
Wow.
And then he was an adult who knew how to hire adults. So we ended up with a nice mix of young, naive, over-optimistic people who still we controlled everything. And then the adults who could ask us to think twice before we did 3 crazy things per day. So it was a really great blend of skills. And we learned how to accept the fact that they weren't quite as intense as we were. I mean, they had like wives and kids and things. So they would leave at some point during the day.
Or night. That leads me to a question that I had for you about the early days and your work ethic. You've been quoted as saying and probably something that we can all relate to. In your 20s and 30s, you were in the go-go years of Microsoft. You didn't take vacations. You basically all you did was work. When you look at in hindsight those years and what those yielded, and you look at founders today, would you give that same advice? How would you approach even the concept of work-life balance, or do you think that's not possible for early stage founders?
Well, I think you can worship and mythologize the idea of working extremely hard for my particular makeup, I mean, it really is true that I didn't believe in weekends, I didn't believe in vacations. I mean, you know, I knew everybody's license plate, so I could tell you over the last month when their car had come and gone from the parking lot. So I don't recommend it. I don't think most people would enjoy it. Once I got into my 30s, I could hardly even imagine how I had done that, because by then some natural behavior kicked in, and I loved weekends, and you know, my girlfriend liked vacations, and that turned out to be kind of a neat thing. Now I take lots of vacations. I mean, my 20-year-old self is so disgusted with my current self. You know, I was sure I would never do anything but ride and coach. You know, now I have a plane. So it's very much counter-revelations have taken place at high speed. But yes, it is nice if during those first several years, if you have a team that's chosen to be pretty maniacal about the company. And how far that goes, you should have a mutual understanding, so you're not one person expecting one thing, another person expecting another thing. And you'll have individuals who have, you know, health or relatives or things that are distracted. But yes, I have a fairly hardcore view that there should be a very large sacrifice made during those early years, particularly if you're trying to do some engineering things that you have to get the feasibility. And you know, in the software world, it's very, particularly for platforms, these are winner-take-all markets. So you know, the greatest mistake ever is whatever mismanagement I engaged in that caused Microsoft not to be what Android is. That is, Android is the standard phone platform, non-Apple phone platform. That was a natural thing for Microsoft to win. And you know, it really is winner take all. You know, if you're there with half as many apps or 90% as many apps, you're on your way to complete doom. There's room for exactly one non-Apple operating system, and that, you know, what's that worth? 400 billion that would be, you know, transferred from company G to company M. And it's amazing to me, having made, you know, one of the greatest mistakes of all time, and there was this antitrust lawsuit and various things, that, you know, our other assets, Windows, Office, are still very strong. So we are a leading company. If we'd gotten that one right, we would be the leading company. But oh well.
The difference between A and D.
So this idea that just small differences can magnify themselves, that doesn't exist for a lot of businesses. You know, if you're a service business, it doesn't exist. But for software platforms, it's absolutely gigantic. And so that's partly where you have the mentality of every night you think, am I screwing this up? And eventually, we did screw a super important one up.
When you think about, you know, you've been, I guess, like, I would bet on you to find the key to reversing aging. It's a personal opinion. When you do find that, and you could go back to your 20s, what would you start?
Well, AI, the paradigmatic question for anybody who's ever written a piece of software is, what is the software that's controlling a human? Its ability to write symphonies, play chess, engage in social activity, you know, read. You know, computers, we picked that AI, we would define AI by certain sensory perception thing, primarily speech understanding and vision, and that those would be the frontier. Also chess playing, but that turned out to be really solvable, that is to be better than humans by brute force techniques. So that kind of got taken off about 15 years ago. But you're always wondering, when can I create a computer that could take, say, a textbook, read it, take the AP exam, and get a 5? And you know, that's completely unsolved. So the most interesting, you know, this guy Hilbert laid out 22 problems for mathematicians in 1900. You know, if you think of the equivalent in software, problem number 1 that sort of subsumes most of the other problems Although there are things about simulating the environment that are also interesting. But anyway, problem number 1 is not solved. And so that's what you would work on. If your mind, from age, say, 11, is thinking about software and what can it do, what can it not do, and then you think you're really good at writing code, and then you meet somebody who's better, and you think, okay, now I'm really good. Then you meet somebody who's better. By age 18, actually, you might be pretty good. So the rest of your life, you're going to think about the structure of the software that can do the equivalent of what a human can do. So I would definitely be drawn to that. Now, it turns out at this era, that's not the only interesting problem. I mean, there's certain problems in biology. Diseases of the poor are one that I'm obsessed with. Yeah. I'm not doing the test tubes myself, but I get to help pick and fund the people working on those things. And there's also things in energy that have to do with inventions that would avoid climate change. So, I would definitely do software because that's what my brain, it's like Bobby Fischer playing chess. I mean, your mind gets molded and shaped in a pretty permanent way to the obsessive problems of age 11 to 21.
When you think about the last few decades and your being such an iconic entrepreneur and founder for obviously this room and many others, but also in seeing how entrepreneurship has changed and shifted over the last few decades, and then being in present day where you are spending more time with the next generation of founders on many different subjects. One of them is philanthropy. What have you observed that has changed over the last few decades in terms of entrepreneurship, and what are you learning from founders of the next generation?
Well, I'm sure it's nice that the idea of being a founder is a thing. That is, that you can meet other people doing it, and the notion that if your first one isn't perfect, that it's okay to do a second one. And there's all these people who want to hand you money now. It's got a real ecosystem. Now, to go with that nice feature, it also means that the ease of entry, and therefore, unless you've come up with something really outthought everyone, there are a dozen other people who say, okay, let's design drugs with machine learning.
Right.
Let's do radiology with machine learning. So you get to move fast, you get to see the patterns, you don't have to invent a lot of things, even a lot of things you don't even have to do inside the company anymore. Yeah. Like cloud computing simplifies the ability to scale at a moment's notice. But you do get intense competition, including from the existing giants that are kind of scanning the world with close to infinite R&D resources. So, I think there's a lot more thinking that goes into about, okay, what do I want my company to be like? There's, you can look at Netflix and say, do I want to do, because he's a very innovative thinker about doing things slightly differently than what other people have done. And, Reid Hoffman writes books that are fantastic. So it's a more understood field, whereas then the idea of, okay, you're 19 years old, they won't let you rent a car, you have a company. It was so bizarre that actually people would overreact, and once they realized that such a thing existed, they would expect you to understand and know things that you had no clue about it, because it was almost like a wild card that you can write software better than my entire software engineering team can. So I think it's great that it's well established, and some of these practices about treating your workers well, thinking about diversity. I mean, these are also require energy to do these things, but the field is so much better about making these companies good. And the companies themselves, of course, the private sector and the innovation in the private sector is the primary reason why things are improving. Philanthropy has this very specialized role to play. So the companies themselves, the likelihood you'll do more good through your philanthropy than through the company you do, that there can be cases like that, but particularly if you're thoughtful about it, the work you do in your company does have huge benefits to the world.
Well, that leads me to a question that I think many founders these days are pondering, which is, social impact and creating a culture that's focused around social good, to what you just mentioned, is a core part of at least expectation setting in this part of the world, in our little bubble here. But, I wondered what your thoughts are on how early a leader of a company or a founder should be thinking about giving back. And I think you have a really interesting perspective on this that's pretty well informed, but maybe you could share that perspective with the audience about, should we be giving back as early as possible? Should we be compounding value in our companies? How do you think about hybrid model?
Well, I'm always trying to convince companies that they should do employee giving, payroll deduction, have nonprofits come in and talk. It used to be that people would structure that around the United Way campaign. Now you can still do that, but a lot of people sort of create their own. But I think having the company, kind of different parts of the company compete to be the most generous and sit and learn about, there's a lot of people who are in tough situations that it's easy to forget when you work in these companies. I think that's good for the company. I also think the founders, even though you're not going to have a lot of liquidity, the idea of picking one local cause that you're engaged with, sometimes with your spouse, sometimes not necessarily. So you start down that learning curve, like, okay, pick a charter school that you go by and get to know the people who are at that charter school and what their challenges are. Go to the local public school, or there's dozens of other things. I think it doesn't work well to just do your company and then think, okay, where are these needs? Because you won't, the fact that it's so different, that is, there's no market signals, and the expertise about measuring things is very different, you'll have a hard time doing it. So like Mark Zuckerberg, he's starting his giving at a much younger age, in his early 30s, where I did my pilot giving in my late 40s and then moved into the serious giving relative to the amount I had, not until my 50s.
You said that the most important speed issue is often not technical but cultural in an organization, and it's convincing everybody that the company's survival depends on moving as fast as possible. And you've touched on that a little bit this morning around the early days and the importance of that continuity of effort and focus on velocity. I'm wondering, when you think about the disciplines and the lessons and the approaches that you're bringing from your years at Microsoft into the world of philanthropy, and particularly around the areas of focus today, global health, energy, education, how are you seeing the effectiveness of those lessons and disciplines and approaches in this sort of new area of focus?
Yeah, of course, the word philanthropy, like entrepreneurship, covers a big range of things. What my wife Melinda have chosen to do is to create an organization that is taking responsibility for reducing and eliminating the diseases of the poor, which are infectious diseases. And so, we spend $5 billion in total. About a bit over $2 billion of that is sort of drug and vaccine R&D. And so I get to, when I say, okay, we're going to build a TB drug team, we're going to build a TB vaccine team, we're going to build a, kill all the mosquitoes in the world, gene drive CRISPR team. I get to, in terms of how we fund that, organize it, how many locations, do we wait till they have this result before we scale it up? I get to use the same, or 80% the same type of thinking that I exercised in terms of, okay, let's go do Windows, let's go do Excel. So it's backing engineers, it's getting a sense of the team, what needs to be added to that team, or the IQs on the team adding up as opposed to subtracting from each other. And it's very comfortable because the most intense period of Microsoft was where these teams were about size 30. And for our diseases, typhoid, rotavirus, there's a lot of diseases that hopefully you'll never hear of again, most of which don't exist here in the US. But so it is very, very similar. It takes a decade generally from start to finish. The AIDS vaccine, actually, we're on year 14, and it'll probably be another 8 to 10 years before that one is completely done. So some take as long as 20 years because there's many dead ends, and you have kind of a portfolio of approaches. But yes, I feel like my working with governments, hiring smart people, managing teams, it did prepare me well for this very operational organization that's a lot like a business, except that our profit is lives saved as opposed to a monetary measure. So, the 0 to 5 mortality, which was 11 million a year in 1990, and now is under 6 million a year. Our metric is, by 2030, can we get that to 3 million a year? And if so, we did a good job. And it's very doable. So there is feedback there. Now we had to create a whole measurement system to go out and make sure we understood not only the number of deaths, but the causes of deaths so that we can tackle the right things. So compared to most philanthropy, where you think, okay, I'll write this nice check to this organization, it's a very hands-on thing because I like using these skills that I'm addicted to.
Yeah. You have commented on numerical literacy in our society, and as an example, you note that people dramatically overestimate how much the U.S. spends on foreign aid. What's your best idea on how to make Americans more knowledgeable about where their tax dollars go?
Yeah, the idea that democracy involves sort of studying the budget and knowing how much is spent, and candidate A proposes to change it in this way, and candidate B proposes to change it that way, and it's this very technocratic exercise where people actually understand those big numbers. The closer you get to the more you realize, wow, that is not what's going on here. Even members of Congress, the complexity of the budget and the trade-offs there are a few who put those pieces together. The general idea that foreign aid is less than 1%, and that it basically saves lives for less than $500 per life saved, that's a very hard thing to get across. And even if you did get that across to people, I don't know if they're as shocked as they should be that, oh, you mean I write a check for $500, I buy more measles campaigns, and literally I saved a child's life? Because we view lives, we behave, and I think appropriately, as though lives here in the US are worth many millions of dollars. I mean, we will spend $10 million in a acute, say, certain type of child with cancer type situation, that those are our values. So anyway, there's this contrast. The idea that you could get people to decide to support this foreign aid thing, which is a big deal for our foundation, from a numeric point of view, we're still pushing that a little bit, but honestly, the story of the one child, if you say to an audience, here's the picture of this child, shall we save this child? They're more engaged than if you said, hey, let's save 1 million children. So there's definitely a sort of, 10 to the 6th problem here somewhere.
Yeah, that's
that
fascinating.
Humans are not wired to do that on a numeric basis. And so, that's why we have people like Bono and many others who come from a more storytelling world, and then they let me throw a few charts and numbers in, just because I think that should be there. Once your heart tells you what direction to go in, to prove that this is a very affordable, not a big deal, well-managed path to be on.
When you think about your more domestic areas of focus, K through 12 education is one of them. How do you think about the issues that face Americans, and are you finding more energy around those issues when you speak to audiences stateside, or are you? How do you think about the differences of, the American plight versus the rest of the world?
Yeah, so we do two things. We do this global stuff with health at the center, and that's about 80%.
Yeah.
And then here in the US, our centerpiece is education, including both K through 12 and higher ed, but K through 12 is the biggest piece. We thought that because US education is here and everybody's so rational and wants to do it so well, that we'd have big wins in US education, like cut the dropout rate in half. The US has the highest dropout rates both in high school and in college, higher than any country in the world. So we actually have more people enter higher education than any other country. We have 12 countries who graduate more people from higher ed than we do. And in terms of cost of education, the person who really is in bad shape is the one who paid that cost and didn't get the degree. That's a bad deal. Actually, if you get the degree, if it wasn't some for-profit culinary cooking school that was fooling you about job opportunities. So except for a few, maybe 10% of the cases, it's actually not such a bad situation. In any case, our success in terms of the macro numbers, like high school dropouts, math test scores, verbal test scores, where the US also lags many other countries, particularly Asian countries. Our success there is very small. We poured a lot in, and yes, I can point to charter schools that we've been involved in that if you go and visit, it'll be very uplifting, and that's great. And that, that's close to 1 million kids a year, but there's 52 million kids in the US in K through 12, so if you help 1 million, you won't see it. It's in the rounding error of the macro measurements of that system. It's a system that spends, ignore philanthropy, $10,000 per student per year. And so philanthropy, you have to have a theory, why could philanthropy, this is true for all these things, why is philanthropy sort of like investing a dollar to found Google? Why is it so overall impactful? And the answer is that this is an enterprise that has no R&D department. That is, it's studying why certain teachers can teach you 2 years of math, whereas that other teacher over there makes you think that math's not for you. What is that person doing? And there are certainly people with incredible natural skills who figured it out on their own. That is not well understood, nor is there an attempt to scale up what that top 10% practice is looking like. We did 20,000 hours of videos of the very, very best teachers and the other teachers, and we analyzed it, and we figured out the key characteristics. But getting the training system to move that across, so that the top 40% could be as good as the top 10%. Anyway, that did not succeed. So it's far more difficult. Partly because your money is tiny compared to the thing. Also, people are basically satisfied with the way it is. You can get a small group and say, hey, let's make this better. But then when you say, okay, that means your neighborhood school is going to shut down, or the teacher in your neighborhood is going to feel some pressure on them, then people always say their neighborhood school is good, but the school system as a whole is very bad. Anyway, this one is one that we underestimated how hard it is, and we're on our sort of third revision of the strategy. Still very committed to it, And truthfully, we probably helped more like 4 million out of 50 million. So it's starting to show a little bit in the numbers. So, hope remains eternal. And because the one we thought was hard, global health, happened so much bigger, at least we know we're not completely stupid. So it gives you, it's nice if at least some of your projects are going well. It really does help you persevere in the one that appears to be way harder than you imagined.
Well, it sounds like you are exuding the characteristics of a possibilist, which brings me to my next question around your book list. One of the books on your list this year that has really spoken to me is Factfulness by Hans Rosling, where he talks about not being an optimist but being a possibilist. I highly recommend you read the book starting today, if I could say so myself. But your book list is a gift, because it's not only is it a curation of books in a world where we're inundated with content, but it's also a window into the subjects you're learning more about, and that may inform us of the work that you'll do in the future. So when I look at the books from this past year, I see themes of optimism, definitely perspective building, poverty, energy, and I also see that in the areas of focus for you. When you think about the books that you're reading this year and what we may see on the list next year, what themes do you think we'll notice in what you're absorbing or reading today?
Well, the nice thing now that I'm not so extreme. In my 20s, I didn't get to read much at all.
Yeah.
And so like all this stuff was going on in biology and math. I just didn't get to read it. Then when I did get into my 30s, those vacations were a time to go back. Because when I was a student, you could study all sorts of things. Anyway, now, I read a lot of science, and that uses up, maybe half of the slots that I have. Really understanding U.S. poverty and what's going on there. There's a few dozen books that try and give you a glimpse of that are very good. This book, Factfulness, let me say, it definitely creates a framing for what's going on in the world. And the other one that's right up there is any Pinker book, starting with Better Angels of Our Nature. Yeah. So the world is improving in all these unbelievable ways, and yet the human characteristic is to look at where it's not improving or where it might not improve. And so you have this paradox that with all this improvement, both in rich countries and in poor countries, arguably improving even faster in poor countries, although people tend then to focus not on the ones that are improving, but on the one that's still left behind, so you have adverse selection. Unless you have that notion that this system of capitalism and call it Western democracy has worked out extremely well, the temptation to say, oh, no, this is not a good system, let's take a risk and try something very, very different, it's very high. And so it is scary. Like if you take this book, Factfulness, the group that is least aware of the improvements in the world are professors at U.S. universities. So when they have this test of how many kids are in poverty now, how many kids are dying now, the people who are the furthest below 50%, which is the chimp level achievement, the people who manage to get all the way down to 20% are professors at U.S. universities. It's the lowest group ever tested. Anyway, because they have a mindset that, oh, I come in and tell people about these problems, and they don't really have, step back and look at some of these key statistics. So, I do worry that if you don't get a lot of people thinking about that, then you won't, continue things like globalism, multilateralism,
Right.
aid generosity, and working together, because the really hard problems like not having big pandemics or solving climate change or not having big wars, those are all things that require countries to work together. There really are no super big problems that don't require countries to work together.
And interestingly enough, in the latest goalkeeper report with this, you do a great job of being very transparent about the wins and the challenges. You are making a pretty bold. It's very, very clear that you want people to know that the global poverty deceleration is stalling out and could actually reverse. Can you talk just a little bit about what are you trying to get out there beyond the obvious of just facts, and why was that the headline?
Yeah, so the development in the world, it starts with the West, sort of Europe, US, then post-war, Japan comes into that. And you have by say 1960, a very bimodal world. You have rich countries and poor countries, and you have no middle-income countries. Well, very few. Then, as we progress, what happens is the vast majority of the world's population moves into middle-income status. Brazil, Mexico, China, India most notably, they represent 37% of the world between them. And so poor countries become an exception, and rich countries are less than 20%. One of the measures used in that game is the extreme poverty measure, $1.90 per day, which is a World Bank thing. And so by that measure, we had 36% in 1990. Now we have 9%. That 9% is increasingly in one continent, increasingly in Africa. And on current trends, by 2050, 90% of the extreme poor will be in Africa. And the population dynamics are such that Asia has almost no more population growth. It has a little bit left because people are living longer. But China's shrinking, India's tailing off in a big way. None of the big countries are high population growth. You still have Afghanistan and Yemen, but that's not big numbers. So the number of babies in the world goes down a tiny bit every year of the century, but its mix goes from being 25% in Africa to 50% in Africa. And so Africa goes from 1 billion people to 4 billion people. So when we get to 11 billion, we're at 7 now, most of the increment is in Africa. The rest is the aging Asians living longer, that they go from 4 to 5 billion. Anyway, so Africa is hard. The quality of governance, the disease burden, the infrastructure. And so in this report, we say, look, that's great, we got to 9%, but we could stay at 9% for the next 30 years unless we do a lot of really good investments in health and education and governance in Africa. One country in Africa, Nigeria, is headed to be the 3rd largest country in the world, 800 million by the end of the century. So actually China will have shrunk by then. But anyway, so they have India, China, and Nigeria will be about the same size. And Nigeria's not very big, and so it's daunting. And anybody who's spent time in the tougher African countries, that will test this notion that we'll be able to continue the mind-blowing improvement that we've had. Even in Africa, literacy's gone from 20% to 75%. Lifetimes are much longer. But until you get a certain quality of governance, then you can't get roads, you can't get electricity, you can't get schools, you can't get basic health care. And so their governance right now in many areas is below that threshold. So we like to give good news, but we like to really be honest about this mix shift challenge that we're faced with.
Well, it's time for me to stop hogging the mic, and if you'd like to ask Bill a question, we have 2 mics, one here and one there, and we'll alternate. Hey. Varsha. How are you?
Good, should I start?
Yes, please.
Okay,
And if
great.
you don't mind introducing yourself.
Hi, I'm Varsha Rao. I'm the COO of Clover Health, and I'm a friend of Village Global. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for having me. And thank you, guys. Bill, what is the most impactful, specific, unsolved problem that could be solved in your mind with technology that you'd like to see someone take on?
Well, this idea of reading in general, if you can do that, then you can create an agent that helps a student like a one-on-one tutor would. There's nothing that matches a great one-on-one tutor teaching somebody. That's always the gold standard that all other teaching methodologies are compared to. And the misconceptions people have in math, if you really truly understand math, you can see those misconceptions and help people work through problems that get them very used to the manipulations and the visualization. So I'd say there are some learning tutor things that I would love to see done. I'd love to see the foundation's biggest quest, the one that people everybody knows working on an HIV vaccine, but the biggest one that people don't really appreciate is that 40% of kids in poor countries, their body and brain never develops. That is, during their early years, the disease and nutrition characteristics are such that they have an IQ less than 80. And so what goes on there that has to do with the microbiome and inflammation of the stomach, if we can intervene in that, and it's not a macronutrition thing, there's gross amount good food, their twin is doing well. If we can solve the nutrition thing, that's very gigantic in terms of unlocking human potential.
Thank you.
Hello, hello, Bill. I'm Eyal Amir from AI and Cube. You talked about AI being one of the biggest promises of software, and imagine in 10 years the Microsoft of AI coming about. What would be their business model?
He's asking for a friend.
Well, the so-called personal agent that is permissioned in to see all your information and helps you, instead of you running 20 applications and looking at data in time-ordered view, because it understands your preferences, your context, it is your portal to the world. And so that's a replacement for social networking, search, productivity applications, going to Amazon and picking something. That is the thing that you interface with. And so it collapses what are the giants' current, somewhat uncontested business models, each in their own niche. Facebook, social networking, Amazon, buying Google search. And so it has the opportunity to combine all those different elements. That is an advertising element, a markup element. It'll probably be done on a subscription basis for a lot of people, because this idea of not wondering what the trade-offs are. The advertising model can still exist, though, because there are win-win situations where your desire to know about a new product type is beneficial to you and to the advertiser. So it'd be a mix of subscription and advertising. Probably no transaction fees, because you want to be neutral to the who you end up doing business with. So you don't want to have essentially brand house brand type product or distribution channel things. But the personal agent is the paradigmatic thing that collapses the current order of the software industry. And a company, Google, Microsoft, someone will create that collapse.
Beautiful, thanks.
You mentioned the amazing benefits of Moore's Law. Unfortunately, it's finally over, or at least ending, for sequential computing. We're making a lot of progress with custom ASICs for machine learning, like tensor processing units, but that's a narrower domain. I'm curious if you see any path over the next 40 to 50 years to recover that exponential scaling in computing?
Yeah, this is a very good point. It's a kind of a Václav Smil-like point, which is you do reach plateaus. And in terms of clock speed, a single thread, we reached a plateau actually quite a while ago. We've still been able to get the design rules down, but because of heat density problems, we haven't been able to get clock speed up. Now, the beauty thing is we're using more area, particularly in a cloud-type computing environment, for the problems that can be split across many threads, which is about 98% of all problems if you're super clever. So we're still feeling like, oh my God, we are getting so much extra compute. The two frontiers, there's a thing called crowd computing, where you can go back and up your clock speeds because you superconduct the wires. And there's a few people like Microsoft who are very advanced in this. Weirdly, some people you'd think would work on it aren't working on it. And then there's quantum. And quantum is, I spent a lot of time studying quantum because it's interesting mathematics. Both can we build a quantum computer, when can we build a quantum computer? Quantum computer's not interesting until you have at least 10,000 qubits. Then it's interesting. For a certain class of problems, how big is that class of problems? Weirdly, prime number factorization is, because of Shor's theorem, in that set of things. So you can issue yourself as many bitcoins as you want, among other things that can happen. So quantum, even though Microsoft is putting billions in, and it's very promising, predicting that is not clear. Predicting crowd computing and continue cloud scale out, including taking the FPGA and GPU pieces and integrating those in a much deeper way. I mean, GPUs are very expensive today, and they don't inherently have to be for the dominant ML training and inference things that we do. So there's a generation that will come there that, certainly another factor of 10.
Thank you.
Hi, Jay.
Hi, yeah, Jay. I'm a little hesitant to reveal that I'm on faculty at Stanford.
Great.
But I teach computer science there, and I'm a big believer that there's a huge opportunity for society around learning computer science skills. There's this big need. And then the other trend that we've been talking about among some of my colleagues is just the pressure for, with awesome tools like Khan Academy and all the online learning that's available, the pressure that's coming on the traditional residential university model. What do you think is the right way to usher in kind of the evolution where residential education, the thought leadership universities shrink, and maybe there's less residential education opportunities at the university level for students? What's the right role for those thought leading universities to play?
Well, there's no doubt that Stanford's not under pressure. That is the philanthropy and science grants that are available to it. There is a question, should it try and grow its student body because it's such a wonderful thing for the world to have more students go there. The key schools that really are at risk are the state level schools, where the vast majority of college education in this country is done by four-year state schools. And that's where you still have tuitions that are like $11,000 to $17,000 per year, as opposed to, say, $60,000 per year. Now, that 60 has immense scholarship pieces in it. So if Stanford wants you, that you are not economically blocked from going there, which is fantastic. There's about 5 institutions that can afford to do that. So if you're in the top, 0.1% on merit, and you can make them figure that out, then that works out very well. These state-level institutions are raising tuition because they haven't raised the productivity that much. I do believe that a mix of using more online, sharing more material, can still give us this whole tiering where you have Stanford and Harvard still there, also contributing some of the material that gets used by those other tiers. The other tiers today don't like just taking a course from somebody else. And the number of students who can learn without a social setting around it is very, very small. If you want to learn computer science, just, Knuth wrote the book, buy it, okay. Read it and do the problems if you really think you know this thing. If you want to learn physics, Feynman wrote the book. Just read the damn book. It's all there. So that when we put stuff online, we don't have anything in online physics that's any better than Feynman's book, honestly. Now, it's a little easier to learn. The guy makes jokes every 20 minutes, or at least tries to, and he does more demos and things. So learning is a weird social phenomena. And so, our foundation, our big problem is that the group that does the worst with online learning are low-income students, because their notion of why am I learning, their sense of self-confidence, the ability to figure out, I just got stuck because, 2 minuses cancel out, and I never saw that notation before. They just hit dead ends all the time, that if you're sitting in your dorm at Stanford, somebody walks down and helps you get through it. And so we have not solved the problem of how we get a low-cost education for low-income students where you actually complete. Most community colleges have a greater than 50% dropout rate. Most four-year colleges have a greater than 30% dropout rate. Now, Stanford doesn't have a dropout rate. Why? Because they don't let people in who would drop out. They succeeded the day the admissions department was done. They didn't make those people hardworking. They just picked hardworking people, which it's fine. I have no disagreement with it, but it means this notion of dropping out, it's, most people in this room don't know much about it, about how that comes up and gets discouraging. And so we have to solve not just the cost thing through digitization, but also the framework of motivation, so that a low-income person has as much chance of graduating as a elite person. And we're further away from that today than we've ever been.
Nick?
Great. Hi, Nick Maida, CEO of Gainsight. Bill, throughout the talk you talked about AI encapsulating human reasoning and kind of what it can do around that. What's the algorithm or heuristic you use personally to think about which cause is most worthy? So not which solution is most effective, but which cause to work on, whether it's poverty or disease or anything else?
Yeah, so there are people like Dustin Moskovitz who really went down this path of trying to do it. And it's brilliant and it's worthwhile, and he can share how he went down that path. He actually picked global health as one of the things. Also, avoiding AI taking over the world is another one that
You're like, I got to talk
he
about
picked.
it.
But most people pick their philanthropy because of more of an emotional story type thing. My daughter had anorexia. It turns out, I know a philanthropist whose daughter had anorexia, and he's funded the most amazing research. They're making really great advances. That's phenomenal. There was a philanthropist who had a son with autism. He has funded all the really great genetic understanding. Actually, they solved schizophrenia genetics because that turned out to be way easier. Autism genetics is very complicated, but they are finally getting to the bottom of that. So most people pick things for more emotional reasons. Now, once you get into that domain, then you can be a madman about, hey, why does my school drop out kids? Why are parentless black males having so much harder time in this school than others? What particular things could we do for them? So you can bring your business sense once you've picked your topics. There's so many topics. If you want to save lives for the least money, then come to Seattle and let's work together on that. That's probably rises up. But I didn't pick it because of that. I picked it because of the injustice of letting a kid die There were literally 2 vaccines that were invented for diarrhea and pneumonia that were being given in middle income and rich countries where less than 5% of the deaths from those diseases existed. And the kids who had 95% of the deaths weren't getting the vaccines. That was the paradigmatic thing that made me realize, okay, even though it's similar to what Rockefeller Foundation did, and I didn't want to do the same thing they did, to some degree we're doing the same thing they did.
We're getting like a good musical undertone here. This is really, so I apologize. We don't have any more time for questions right now, but I get to ask you the last question,
Okay.
which is a tradition
Sorry.
here at Village Global. I'm sorry. No founder can change the world alone. It requires a village around you to help you realize your full potential. Who's someone in your village who has been instrumental to your success, and how so?
Well, there's no doubt that creating a board, having people like Dave Marquardt there who wasn't at the company, and we were so overwrought about, this is right, this is wrong, we messed this up, that having people have a little bit of distance come in and talk to us is good. For the last 30 years or so, I've gotten to be friends with Warren Buffett, and he's in Omaha. He's not in this tech world at all, and to him it's like, hey, how could you ever know which will rise and which will fall? I'm not going to put money until Apple sold at a multiple of 12. Then he decided he could put 50 billion into that. After he asked all his friends, hey, if somebody had an iPhone that was half as expensive, would you switch away? Or is it more like jewelry where you really want to have an iPhone? And so he decided that those profit streams might not be eliminated anytime soon. Anyway, because he's not in this world, he has a definite way of looking at things, including this idea of how work should be fun. He has made his work so much fun that he works more hours than I do. He works 6 days a week at 88 years old. And he likes to say that he skips to work every day. He doesn't, but he says that.
It's a good visual.
When he was 83, he could still skip, but now he's gotten really, he can't do it. Having somebody like that, the toughest thing I went through was this antitrust lawsuit where, it didn't seem very predictable, and he was a great counsel during all of that stuff. So getting somebody who's successful in another domain, but yet kind of a business type mindset. Anyway, for me, that was a huge gift.
Bill, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here with you, and thank you to Village Global for giving everybody the opportunity to spend the morning with Bill Gates.
Thank you. Good job. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julia and Bill. What a stimulating conversation, covered so much territory. We now have some time for reception outside, so it's a beautiful day. Those of you who've been to our events before know that we have some question cards at different tables around some of the topics near and dear to Bill and Julia's conversation: giving back, the Gates Foundation, the future of Microsoft, healthcare. So if you're intrigued to have a conversation around those topics, you can stand around those tables, grab a question card, otherwise hang out, grab some food. There are some extraordinary people here to meet. You can also check out the science exhibits here free of charge because of your being our guest at the Exploratorium. So on behalf of all of us at Village Global, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.